Alrighty guys, hello and welcome. Here we are jumping into another PRISM v3 tutorial. Subject of this tutorial is how to get a scene looking as realistic as possible using some of the same post-processing styles and effects that are found in realistic modern AAA games just like GTA 5. So first up, as you can see, I've just got the scene here. I've done all of our usual setup. I've got a post-process layer and a post-process volume here on the camera. And I've just created a new post-process profile. Remember, once you've imported PRISM v3, it does also need the post-processing package to run. So I've got that in there as well. So now from PRISM v3, I'm just going to go ahead and add PRISM scene effects and the PRISM stack. So first off, let's start with PRISM's effects that actually affect the scene. First up, PRISM NNAO, Neural Network Ambient Occlusion. Let's go ahead and tick all of these ones just to get us started here. Now, our goal with the NNAO here is going to be to get some kind of wider occlusion. What we want to do is, create some shadows around these objects that are a little bit floaty at the moment, even though in the lighting bake, we have actually baked in a little bit of ambient occlusion there. We want PRISM Neural Network Ambient Occlusion to offer a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and first off, start this intensity drag that one out to 3. Now, let's use a high sample amount. Again, we are targeting a realistic scene here. We'll use the second blur. We don't need to use temporal blur. That's more of like an optimization option than anything else at the moment. We're going to go ahead and put the down sample amount to 1, which again, because we're targeting high-end platforms, that's going to keep our NNAO as clean as it can be for this demo. Outside of that, I think we can maybe tweak the radius just a little bit. And one thing you can do is actually go into debug mode while you're doing this. And so you can see, with a super low radius, obviously you're going to get that super crisp AO if I just show you that there. And then with a radius that we want about 0.3, because what this is going to do is create some nice shadows around those objects. So about 0.3, we'll set it to around 0.242, and in fact I might just set a little bit high just so it's a little bit more obvious. But overall, I would say that is looking pretty good. In terms of luminance weighting, 0.35 is around about where you want it to be by default. Now, as you can see, when you decrease the luminance weighting, that means the AO will go on to more of the brightest areas of the scene. If you look here, what happens as we increase the luminance weighting, the AO will not apply to these shutters, which are obviously in the very bright sun. So in all honesty, we probably don't actually want much AO on them. So I'm going to keep that pretty high. Realistically speaking, they actually wouldn't get any AO. If you're going for 100% realism, then yes, set it to 1. But, we also want it to kind of feel realistic. And sometimes even a touch of AO there, it does feel a little bit more realistic. So that's why PRISM gives you the option to do that. That, I think, is the ambient occlusion. Now, GTA 5 does use their equivalent of God rays. It's actually a slightly different volumetric shadows effect. So you could enable that, but we're not going to see that in our scene here anyway. So we're not going to go ahead and enable that option. Now, again, a game like GTA 5 does use lens distortions to simulate some of what would be happening on a real camera lens. So we're going to go ahead and enable that in PRISM. And GTA 5 uses lens distortion similar to this. So just a little bit of pin cushioning or barrel distortion, in fact. So as you can see, it's just a subtle effect. We don't want to go crazy. That's not what we're after. Just a subtle effect to pull some of those corners out. As you can see, you can definitely tell the difference, and you can definitely tell on those straight lines, as those straight lines of the wood there get curved out a little bit. It's meant to be a subtle effect. That's the key to realistic post-processing, is not overdoing it. Now, outside of that, GTA and just about every other AAA game with realistic graphics and visuals does use bloom, so we're going to go ahead and enable bloom. Now, a really good tip for anyone looking to get their bloom looking as realistic as possible is to just start off before you even add any intensity to the bloom, is just go ahead and look at Prism's bloom debug setting. So I'm going to go ahead and just enable that one there. There we go. I do actually have to set the intensity just to 0.1 to get that working. And there we go. So we can see Prism's bloom debug setting. And this is how you can tell if your scene is already lit correctly. Because if your scene isn't lit correctly, for example, if you had, this light here, if its emission was set to, 3 instead of the 1 it's set to, then when looking in the bloom debug mode, which is effectively a representation of the brightest parts of the scene, then if this was set too high, this would be pure white. Whereas we know in a realistically lit scene, the bright sky outside is going to be the brightest part. And that's what we can see here with Prism's bloom debug setting. Just as easy as that. One click and you can see that's going to be the brightest part of our scene. That's going to contribute most to the bloom. We're going to get a little bit of blooming on the light, a little bit of blooming on the fireplace and the other lights there, but that's looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and set this bloom. We'll actually just go very, very light on this one, just a touch of bloom. Again, subtlety is the key here when you're working with these realistic effects and and striving for optimum realism. So 0.06 I think looks good. I'll just show you what can happen if you go too high. Now remember that this is really an effect that you can overdo. You can drag it all the way to 5, which, well, there you go. You don't want it at 5. 5 is mainly for mobile games with gamma lighting. When you're using realistic HDR, properly exposed lighting, you only want this value very, very low, about 0.06. And we've got, as you can see here, a nice touch of bloom. Nice touch of bloom on the light there, just helping to really ground that in the scene. We've got a lovely bit of bloom here on the window that really feels like that light is coming inside. And then we've got a touch of bloom on the fireplace because, I mean, let's be honest, fires always look better with bloom. So that's starting to look really good. Now, next up, I think we're going to go ahead and add a lookup texture. Effectively, let's get a bit of color grading. And this scene doesn't look too bad at the moment, but I think it's pretty safe to say that it does look potentially a little flat. So I'm going to use this C-Log LUT, which will be included with this current version of Prism. I'm going to go ahead and also enable the LUT lerp amount and hit go. Now, obviously, this is going to be too much. But of course, with Prism, we can just decrease the LUT lerp amount until we reach a happy medium. So at 0, it's not going to be doing anything. But then, again, this is a filmic lookup texture. I think somewhere around there, I think is looking pretty good. It's given a really nice look to this wood down here. And if we just go ahead and toggle this on and off, again, we can see it's just added that little touch of realistic or filmic look to the scene and, stopped it from looking like a kind of standard PBR shader with a texture applied to it. Now, of course, we also need to add tone mapping. Very crucial step. What tone mapping does is it brings all of the light in the scene effectively down to sRGB ranges, down to 0 to 1, using a special tone mapping curve. Now, Prism's current version uses a high fidelity ACES tone mapping curve. So let's go ahead and apply that. Now, as we can see, because we've actually technically already done a little bit of tone mapping using this high definition lookup texture in Prism, this scene's actually gotten a little bit dark now that we've applied the ACES tone mapping. But what we can do, because again we're technically with this setup doing a sort of a double gamma apply, which we don't need to, we can actually just drag that out a little bit and drag the gamma back. And I think something like that is looking pretty good. The trick that you want to kind of go in and have a real pixel peep at when you're doing things that are a little bit more artistic like this, like setting a gamma offset, is you want to go into these dark parts of your scene and you want to actually check, is that pitch black? And a good way to do that is very simply just, you know, screen capturing this, putting it into paint.net, and you'll see that, or even for that matter, you can head into Prism here, and I'm just trying to find, for example, God Rays Tint. Let's just use that. You can use any of Unity's color droppers, and you'll see that this value here, it's actually not pure black. It's 575. So there you go. That means that's not pure black. That means we're still getting actual definition on, sort of the darkest parts of our scene there. So that's a good value to have. We've got definition in the dark. We've got lovely definition in the light there. We can still see some yellow. We can still see some green. That's looking really good. Now, lastly, to add that last little touch of photographic realism, we're going to go ahead and enable Prism Sharpen using the standard sharpening method. Now, standard is generally your go-to. You generally want to leave it on standard just because it is a pixel level sharpen. It doesn't try and sharpen more than effectively each pixel of the image relative to the pixel next to it, which really means that it can never get it wrong. It's not going to sharpen noise using this setting because there's not going to be any noise in a 1440p image at this fine detail. So if we go ahead and take a look at what the sharpen's actually doing very, very closely, we can see that the actual grains of the wood there are getting really nicely defined. There's not any artifacts added in there, and when you're actually playing this, full screen in a 1440p monitor, you can totally tell that the wood has a much nicer, much more defined texture. And there you go. That's basically it for some starting level realistic post-processing for a realistic scene just like this. Now, you may have noticed that we haven't actually used all of Prism's effects, and again, that's one of the key points about getting a realistically post-processed scene. Just because you've got all of these effects, sometimes it is better to use a bit of restraint to say, okay, you know what? I can just apply a lookup texture, just a tone map. That's all the color correction that I need to do. And just like this, we've got a really realistic looking great result. If we go ahead, for example, and disable all of these effects, we can see what it was like before and what it was like with Prism. And I think these subtle effects here are really taking this scene from looking, to be perfectly honest, a lot like a stock Unity scene that's maybe got some light mapping to it. Put this in, and it is looking a lot closer to what you might see in an architectural visualization in a game, or perhaps, some of these elements here really looking quite cinematic as well. So there you go, guys. Hope you've enjoyed this Prism version 3 tutorial. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to Gadget Games on YouTube. See you in the next one.